A story made with love by FMTJ.
The fog clung to the cobblestones like a living thing, thick and wet, as Eleanor stepped out of the bakery into the pre-dawn cold. She carried a leather satchel heavy with bread, cheese, and dried meat. Her father had fallen ill 3 days ago, and now it was her responsibility to deliver supplies to her uncle's manor, 2 villages away. A journey that would take her through the king's forest before nightfall, if she was lucky. She wasn't supposed to go alone, but the farmhand who'd promised to escort her had broken his leg the night before, and waiting another week wasn't an option. Her uncle needed these provisions for the workers preparing his estate for winter. Eleanor had made the journey twice before, always with her father. She knew the path. She could do this. The town gate creaked open as the guards recognized her. One of them, an older man with a scar across his cheek, shook his head slowly. "Forest isn't safe for a young woman alone," he muttered. "I'll stay on the main road," Eleanor replied, adjusting the strap across her shoulder. "Main road's where the trouble is," the guard said, but he let her pass. The morning stretched out before her, quiet and grey. Eleanor walked quickly, her boots finding rhythm on the dirt path. Fields gave way to scattered trees, then denser woods. She'd been walking for 2 hours when she heard the horse. It came fast, too fast, hooves pounding like thunder. Eleanor barely had time to step off the path before the rider flew past, a young man in a dark cloak, hunched low over his mount. He didn't slow, didn't look back, just vanished into the trees ahead like a ghost. Something wasn't right. Eleanor stood still, listening. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no wind, just the fading echo of hoofbeats and her own breathing. Then she heard the second set of horses. 3 riders this time, armored men with swords at their sides, faces hard as stone. They pulled up short when they saw her, and the one in front leaned forward in his saddle. "A girl," he said. "Did you see a rider come through here?" Eleanor hesitated. These men wore no crest, no banner. They could be the king's soldiers, or they could be something else. "I saw no one," she said. The man's eyes narrowed. He studied her face for a long moment, then glanced at the path ahead. Without another word, he spurred his horse forward, and the others followed. They disappeared into the forest just as quickly as they'd come. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. She stood there, frozen, until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then she forced herself to keep walking. An hour later, she found him. The young man from before was crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his horse tied to a low branch nearby. He looked up sharply as she approached, his hand moving to the dagger at his belt. His face was pale, dirt-streaked, and his dark hair hung in his eyes. He couldn't have been much older than she was, maybe 20 at most. "You told them you didn't see me," he said quietly. Eleanor stopped a few paces away. "I didn't know who they were." "They're the Earl's men," he said, standing slowly, "and they want me dead." She should have walked away right then, should have turned around and found another path. But something in his voice, something raw and honest, made her pause. "Why?" she asked. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust her. Finally, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, sealed with red wax. "Because I'm carrying this," he said. "A letter that proves the Earl has been stealing grain from the king's stores and selling it across the border. If this reaches the magistrate in the next village, the Earl loses everything." Eleanor stared at the letter, then at him. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas," he said. "I was a scribe in the Earl's household. I copied his ledgers, his correspondence. I saw what he was doing. When I tried to leave, he sent his men after me." "Why should I believe you?" Thomas smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "You shouldn't. But you lied to those soldiers anyway." He had a point. Eleanor looked down the path, then back at him. The forest stretched endlessly in both directions, shadows pooling between the trees. If the Earl's men were still searching, they'd find Thomas eventually. And if they found him with that letter, he'd be killed before sunset. "I'm going to the next village," she said. "If you're telling the truth, that's where you need to go too." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You'd travel with me?" "I'd travel in the same direction as you," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." For the first time, something like relief crossed his face. He untied his horse and led it onto the path beside her. They walked in silence for a while, the forest thick and watchful around them. "What's your name?" Thomas asked eventually. "Eleanor. What brings you out here alone?" She told him about her father, her uncle, the supplies she was carrying. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "That's brave," he said. "My sister used to make that kind of journey. She'd never admit she was scared, but I could always tell." "Used to?" Eleanor asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She died 2 winters ago. Fever." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Sometimes silence was kinder than words. They walked for another hour, the path winding deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller here, their branches weaving together overhead like the roof of a great hall. Light filtered through in pale shafts, turning the air gold and green. Thomas stopped suddenly, holding up one hand. Eleanor froze. "What is it?" she whispered. He pointed ahead, where the path split in 2 directions. Standing at the fork was one of the Earl's soldiers, his back to them, scanning the trees. Eleanor's breath caught. They were too far into the open to retreat without being seen, and if they went forward, they'd walk right into him. Thomas leaned close, his voice barely audible. "There's another way, through the ravine, just off the path. It's steep, but it leads to the same place." "How do you know?" "I grew up near here," he said, "before my family moved to the Earl's estate." Eleanor glanced at the soldier, then at Thomas. She didn't know this man, didn't know if his story was true, but the soldier ahead was real, and so was the sword at his hip. "Show me," she said. Thomas led her off the path, moving carefully between the trees. His horse followed, surprisingly quiet for such a large animal. They descended into a narrow ravine, the ground slippery with moss and fallen leaves. Eleanor had to use her hands to steady herself, her satchel swinging awkwardly at her side. At the bottom, a shallow stream cut through the rocks. Thomas helped her across, his hand firm and steady. On the other side, they climbed back up toward the main path, their breath coming hard. When they finally emerged, the soldier was gone. Eleanor leaned against a tree, her legs shaking. Thomas stood beside her, scanning the forest with sharp, careful eyes. "That was too close," he said. She nodded, unable to speak yet. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me back there." Eleanor met his gaze. "I didn't trust you," she said. "I trusted myself." A slow smile spread across his face, the first real one she'd seen. "Fair enough." They started walking again, side by side now, the distance between them somehow smaller than before. The forest path widened as they walked, sunlight breaking through the canopy in scattered pools. Eleanor's breathing had steadied, though her heart still beat faster than usual. She glanced at Thomas from the corner of her eye. He walked with the ease of someone who knew these woods well, one hand resting on his horse's neck. "You said you grew up near here," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "A village called Ashford, 3 miles east. I've heard of it. There was a mill there, wasn't there?" Thomas nodded. "My father worked it, until the Earl bought the land and tore it down to expand his hunting grounds." Eleanor heard the bitterness in his voice. "Is that why you left?" "We had no choice. The Earl offered my father work at the estate. Better than starving." He paused. "But my sister hated it there. Said the walls felt like a cage." Eleanor thought of her own village, small and simple, but free. She couldn't imagine living under the constant watch of soldiers and lords. "Do you ever go back?" she asked. "Sometimes. When I can. Most of the old families are gone now." Thomas looked at her. "What about you? Do you ever want to leave your village?" Eleanor considered the question. She'd thought about it before, late at night, when the house was quiet and her father was asleep. Wondered what lay beyond the hills, beyond the forest. But then morning would come, and there would be work to do, bread to bake, her father to care for. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe, someday." They walked on, the path curving through a section of forest where the trees grew so close, their roots twisted together like braided rope. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Thomas stopped suddenly, tilting his head. "What?" Eleanor whispered. He held up a hand, listening. Then she heard it too. Voices, low and rough, coming from somewhere ahead. Thomas grabbed his horse's reins and pulled it off the path. Eleanor followed, ducking behind a thick oak. They crouched low, barely breathing. Through the trees, she could see 3 men standing near a fallen log. 2 wore the Earl's colours. The third was dressed in plain clothes, his face shadowed by a hood. "The shipment arrives tomorrow," the hooded man said. "Before dawn. You'll have one chance." One of the soldiers spat on the ground. "And the payment?" "Half now, half when it's done." Eleanor's stomach tightened. This wasn't a patrol. This was something else entirely. The hooded man pulled a pouch from his belt and tossed it to the soldier, who caught it with a grin. "Don't disappoint him," the man said. "You know what happens to those who do." The soldiers laughed, low and ugly. Then the 3 of them turned and walked deeper into the forest, their voices fading. Eleanor and Thomas stayed frozen for a long moment. Finally, Thomas exhaled and stood, his jaw tight. "We need to keep moving," he said. "What were they talking about?" Eleanor asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Nothing good." Thomas's eyes were dark. "Come on." They returned to the path, moving faster now. Eleanor's mind raced. A shipment, payment, something secret, something the Earl's soldiers were involved in. She thought of her uncle, alone in his village, waiting for supplies that might never arrive. "Do you think they're planning to steal something?" she asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. "Maybe, or worse." Eleanor wanted to press him, but the look on his face stopped her. Whatever he suspected, it wasn't something he wanted to explain. They walked in silence for a while, the forest growing darker as the sun dipped lower. Eleanor's feet ached, and her satchel felt heavier with every step. But she didn't complain. Thomas hadn't either, and she wasn't about to be the first. Ahead, the path opened into a small clearing. In the center stood an old stone well, its edges crumbling with age. Thomas led his horse to it and peered inside. "Still has water," he said. He pulled a leather flask from his saddlebag and lowered it on a rope. When he pulled it back up, the flask was full. He drank first, then offered it to Eleanor. She hesitated, then took it. The water was cold and clean, the best thing she'd tasted all day. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. Thomas refilled the flask and gave his horse a drink from his cupped hands. Eleanor watched him, noticing the way he moved with quiet efficiency, no wasted motion. He wasn't showy or loud like some of the young men in her village. He just did what needed to be done. "How much farther?" she asked. Thomas glanced at the sky. "If we keep this pace, we'll reach the crossroads by nightfall. There's an inn there, small but safe." Eleanor's shoulders sagged with relief. The thought of a warm fire and a real bed sounded like a dream. They left the clearing and continued on. The path began to climb, winding upward through rocky terrain. Eleanor's legs burned, but she pushed herself forward, determined not to slow Thomas down. At the top of the hill, the forest opened up, and Eleanor gasped. Spread out below them was a valley, green and wide, with a river cutting through it like a silver ribbon. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of a village, smoke rising from its chimneys. "It's beautiful," she said. Thomas stood beside her, his expression softening. "My sister loved this view. We used to come up here when we were young. She'd sit for hours, just watching the valley." Eleanor glanced at him. "You miss her?" "Every day." His voice was quiet, but steady. "She was braver than I ever was. Kinder, too." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, so she just stood beside him, letting the silence speak for itself. After a moment, Thomas turned away. "We should go. We're losing light." They descended into the valley, the path easier now. As they walked, Eleanor thought about what Thomas had said, about his sister, about bravery. She'd always thought of bravery as something loud, something that happened in battles or grand gestures. But maybe it was quieter than that. Maybe it was just getting up every day and doing what needed to be done, even when your heart was heavy. The crossroads appeared as the last light faded from the sky. A small inn stood at the junction, its windows glowing warm and yellow. A wooden sign hung above the door, creaking in the breeze. Thomas tied his horse to a post outside. "Wait here," he said. "I'll see if they have rooms." Eleanor leaned against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Her legs trembled, and her satchel felt like it was full of stones. A few minutes later, Thomas returned. "They have one room left," he said. "I told them it's yours. I'll sleep in the stable." Eleanor frowned. "You don't have to do that." "I know." Thomas met her eyes. "But I want to." Before she could argue, he turned and led his horse toward the stable. Eleanor watched him go, something warm and unexpected stirring in her chest. She pushed open the inn's door and stepped inside. The warmth of the inn wrapped around Eleanor like a blanket. She stood just inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the firelight. The main room was small but clean, with a low ceiling crossed by dark wooden beams. A handful of travellers sat at rough-hewn tables, speaking in low voices. The innkeeper, a stout woman with grey hair pinned back in a bun, wiped her hands on her apron and approached. "You're the one with the young man?" she asked. Eleanor nodded. "He's gone to the stable." The woman's expression softened. "He's a good one, that fellow. Paid for your room and your supper both. Wouldn't hear a word otherwise." She gestured toward a narrow staircase. "Third door on the left. I'll bring food up shortly." Eleanor climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. The room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was clean. A single candle burned on the sill, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She set down her satchel and sank onto the bed, closing her eyes. For the first time all day, she let herself feel the weight of everything. The fear that had driven her from her village, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, and something else too, something she couldn't quite name. It had to do with Thomas, with the way he'd looked at the valley, with the quiet steadiness in his voice when he spoke about his sister. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. The innkeeper entered with a tray, bread, cheese, a bowl of thick stew, and a cup of something warm. "Eat," the woman said. "You look half-starved." Eleanor thanked her and ate slowly, savouring every bite. The stew was rich and hearty, the bread still warm. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. When she finished, she washed her face and hands in the basin, then lay down on the bed. Sleep came quickly. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned, and she sat up, brushing hair from her face. Her body ached, but it was a dull ache, bearable. Downstairs, the main room was quieter now. Most of the travellers had already left. Thomas sat at a corner table, a plate of bread and dried meat in front of him. He looked up when she approached. "You slept well?" he asked. Better than I have in weeks. She slid onto the bench across from him. Thank you. For the room. For everything. He shook his head. You don't need to thank me. I do, though. She met his eyes. You didn't have to help me. But you did. Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. We should leave soon. The next stretch is longer. No villages for 2 days. Eleanor's stomach tightened. 2 days? There's a path through the hills. It's safer than the main road, but harder. We'll need to carry enough water. He glanced at her. Can you manage it? She thought about the blisters on her feet, the soreness in her legs. Then she thought about what waited behind her if she turned back. I can manage. They gathered their things and left the inn. Thomas's horse was already saddled, supplies packed. The morning air was cool and fresh, the sky a pale blue. They walked in silence for a while, following a narrow path that led away from the crossroads. The landscape changed as they climbed. Trees gave way to scrub and rock. The path grew steeper, winding between boulders and along the edges of cliffs. Eleanor's breath came harder now, but she kept pace. At midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of an overhang. Thomas shared his water and food without comment. Eleanor noticed the way he rationed everything carefully, making sure she had enough before taking his own share. Can I ask you something? She said. Thomas looked at her. Go ahead. Why are you really doing this? Helping me, I mean. He was quiet for a long moment. I told you, my sister. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? Thomas picked up a small stone, turning it over in his fingers. When she died, I wasn't there. I was away, working. By the time I got word and came back, it was too late. He tossed the stone away. I keep thinking, if someone had helped her when she needed it, maybe things would have been different. So when I see someone who needs help, I can't just walk past. Eleanor felt something shift inside her. I'm sorry. About your sister. So am I. He stood, brushing dust from his trousers. We should keep moving. They continued through the afternoon, the path growing more treacherous. At one point, Eleanor's foot slipped on loose gravel, and she stumbled. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her. His grip was firm, but gentle. Careful, he said. She nodded, heart pounding. Not from the fall, but from the brief contact, from the way his hand had reached for her without hesitation. As the sun began its descent, Thomas led them off the main path toward a cluster of trees. We'll camp here tonight, he said. There's a stream just beyond those rocks. Eleanor helped gather wood, while Thomas built a fire. The flames caught quickly, crackling and bright. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, eating in comfortable silence. Above them, stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was filled with them. I've never seen so many stars, Eleanor said. Thomas looked up. Out here, away from the villages, you can see everything. She wrapped her arms around her knees. Do you ever wonder what's beyond them? Beyond what we can see? Sometimes. His voice was thoughtful. My sister used to say the stars were lanterns lit by people who'd passed on, so they could find their way home. Eleanor smiled. I like that. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Eventually Thomas stood. You should sleep. I'll keep watch. You need rest too. I'll sleep after you. His tone left no room for argument. Eleanor lay down near the fire, using her satchel as a pillow. She closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of dying flames and the distant sound of the stream. She felt safe here, in this wild place, with this quiet man keeping watch. When she woke, it was still dark. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Thomas sat nearby, his back against a tree, eyes closed. She watched him for a moment, noticing the lines of exhaustion on his face. He'd stayed awake far longer than he should have. Quietly, she added wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. Then she settled back down, pulling her cloak tighter. As she drifted off again, she realized something. Trust wasn't something you could demand or expect. It was built slowly, through small actions, through keeping promises, through showing up day after day, even when it was hard. Thomas had shown her that, without saying much at all. When morning came, they rose and continued their journey. The path descended now, leading them back toward forested land. Eleanor's legs felt stronger today, her steps more certain. She was learning the rhythm of travel, the way to pace herself. Around midday, Thomas stopped suddenly. He held up a hand, signaling silence. Eleanor froze. He tilted his head, listening. Then she heard it too. Voices, somewhere ahead. Multiple voices, rough and low. Thomas motioned for her to step off the path, behind a large boulder. They crouched there, hidden, as the voices grew louder. Through a gap in the rocks, Eleanor could see them. 3 men, armed, moving along the path they'd just been traveling. Bandits. Thomas pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes locked on the men ahead. Eleanor barely breathed. The bandits moved slowly, scanning the trees, their weapons drawn. They were searching for something, or someone. One of them spoke. "Tracks lead this way. Can't be far." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Were they being hunted? Thomas leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here. Don't move until I come back." Before she could protest, he was gone, slipping between the trees like a shadow. Eleanor pressed herself against the boulder, heart hammering. She could still see the bandits through the gap in the rocks. They'd stopped now, arguing about which direction to go. Then Thomas appeared behind them. He moved with absolute silence, positioning himself near a fallen log. He picked up a stone and threw it hard into the brush on the opposite side of the path. The bandits spun toward the sound, weapons raised. "There!" one shouted. They rushed toward the noise, leaving the path clear. Thomas motioned to Eleanor. She didn't hesitate. She ran, low and fast, across the open ground. He caught her hand and pulled her into the dense forest, away from the path entirely. They moved quickly, weaving through trees, putting distance between themselves and the bandits. Eleanor's lungs burned, but she kept pace. Thomas didn't slow until they'd crossed a rocky stream and climbed a steep embankment on the other side. Finally, he stopped. Eleanor bent over, catching her breath. Who were they? Mercenaries, maybe, or men who've turned to theft because the war took everything else. He scanned the forest behind them. Either way, we can't go back to the main path. Not yet. Will they follow us? Not across water. Most trackers lose the trail there. He looked at her, his expression serious. But we'll need to be more careful now. They walked in silence for a long while, moving parallel to the path but hidden within the forest. The terrain was rougher here, filled with roots and uneven ground. Eleanor stumbled more than once, but she didn't complain. As the afternoon wore on, the trees began to thin. Ahead, Eleanor could see open land, fields possibly, and beyond that, smoke rising from chimneys. "A village," Thomas said. "We'll rest there tonight." Relief washed over her. The thought of a real bed, a warm meal, felt like a distant dream. They approached carefully, watching for signs of trouble. But the village seemed peaceful. Children played near a well, women carried baskets, men worked in the fields. Life, ordinary and steady. Thomas led them to a small inn at the edge of the village. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of bread and stew. An older woman stood behind a wooden counter, wiping it down with a rag. 2 rooms, Thomas said, placing coins on the counter. The woman eyed them both, then nodded. Upstairs, last 2 on the left. Eleanor followed Thomas up the narrow staircase. Her room was small but clean, with a bed, a wash basin, and a single window overlooking the fields. She set down her satchel and sank onto the bed, exhaustion hitting her all at once. A knock came at the door. Thomas stood in the hallway, holding a bowl of stew and a piece of bread. "Thought you might be hungry." She took it gratefully. "Thank you." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, then nodded and turned to leave. "Thomas," he stopped. "You didn't have to do that. Earlier, I mean, drawing them away." He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I did." Then he was gone. Eleanor ate slowly, thinking about his words, about the way he'd risked himself without hesitation. She barely knew this man, yet he'd protected her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That night, she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A shutter creaked in the wind. She thought about the journey ahead, about the uncertainty waiting in the next village, but mostly she thought about trust, how it wasn't given lightly, how it had to be earned, piece by piece, through actions that spoke louder than promises. Morning came too quickly. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the window. She dressed and went downstairs, where Thomas was already waiting, his pack slung over his shoulder. They ate a quick breakfast, then set out again. The road beyond the village was wider, more travelled. They passed farmers with carts, a group of pilgrims heading toward a distant monastery, a merchant with 2 heavily loaded mules. Eleanor felt lighter today, stronger. The fear from yesterday had faded, replaced by something steadier. Determination, maybe, or confidence. Around midday, they reached a crossroads. A wooden sign pointed in 3 directions. Thomas studied it, frowning. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked. "The northern route is faster, but it cuts through disputed land. The eastern road is safer, but it adds 2 days to the journey." Eleanor considered. "What would you choose?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. "It's not my choice to make. You're the one with somewhere to be." She met his gaze. "I trust your judgment." Something shifted in his expression, a softness she hadn't seen before. "Then we go north, but we stay alert." They took the northern road. It was quieter here, less travelled. The land rose and fell in gentle hills, dotted with wildflowers and ancient stone markers. Eleanor found herself noticing details she'd missed before. The way light filtered through the leaves, the patterns birds made as they flew overhead. She glanced at Thomas, walking beside her. He was always watching, always listening. But there was a calmness to him now, a quiet presence that made her feel grounded. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Why did you agree to travel with me? You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything." Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My sister used to say that we're all walking the same road, just at different times. When someone needs help, you give it. Because one day, you'll need it too." Eleanor smiled. "She sounds wise." She was. They walked on, side by side, as the sun climbed higher. The road stretched ahead, winding through the hills, leading them toward whatever waited beyond. That evening, they reached the edge of a forest. Not dense like before, but open, with wide spaces between the trees. Thomas found a clearing where they could see in all directions. They built a fire, ate dried meat and bread, and watched the stars appear. Eleanor felt a strange contentedness settle over her. This journey, with all its uncertainty and danger, had taught her something important. Connection wasn't about perfect circumstances or carefully planned meetings. It was about showing up, about choosing to walk beside someone, even when the road was difficult. Thomas looked over at her. "Tomorrow, we'll reach the village. Your family will be there." Eleanor nodded. "And you? Where will you go?" He poked the fire with a stick. "Wherever the road takes me." She wanted to ask him to stay, to see if this quiet understanding between them could grow into something more. But she knew better than to rush. Some things needed time. Maybe our roads will cross again, she said softly. Thomas met her eyes. Maybe they will. And in that moment, beneath a sky full of stars, Eleanor understood. Love wasn't something you chased or demanded. It was something you built, slowly and carefully, with trust and patience and respect. The fire crackled, the night deepened, and tomorrow the road would continue. They reached the village just after dawn, when mist still clung to the rooftops and smoke rose lazy from morning fires. Eleanor's uncle stood in the doorway of his manor, relief flooding his weathered face when he saw her. He embraced her tightly, asking questions she answered in fragments. Safe journey, no trouble, a companion who helped along the way. Thomas stood apart, holding his horse's reins, watching the reunion with quiet eyes. When Eleanor's uncle approached to thank him, Thomas simply nodded and said it was nothing. But Eleanor knew better. Her uncle invited Thomas inside for a meal, but he declined. "I have business to finish," he said, touching the letter still hidden in his cloak. Eleanor walked with him to the edge of the village. Neither spoke at first. The morning sun broke through the clouds, painting everything gold. "Will you be safe?" she asked. "When you deliver that letter?" "I'll be careful." He adjusted his pack. "And you? Will you make it home all right?" "My uncle's men will escort me. I'll be fine." They stood there, the space between them filled with unspoken things. Thomas looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Eleanor understood. Some feelings were too new, too fragile to name. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything." He met her eyes. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor." Then he mounted his horse and rode toward the magistrate's house, disappearing around the bend. Eleanor watched until he was gone. Her chest felt tight, but not with sadness, with possibility, with the knowledge that some connections, once made, didn't simply end. They waited, patient and quiet, for the right time to grow. She turned back toward the manor, where her uncle stood waiting. The road had taught her something valuable. That true connection wasn't built in a single journey, but in the choice to keep walking forward, even when the path was uncertain. And perhaps, when the time was right, their roads would cross again,